The gingerbread cookie lay like a small, ruined promise in Maya's palm. A crescent of brown crust and sugar, a jagged edge where it had split. Cinnamon dusted the creases of her fingers. She cupped it as if its warmth could be pressed back together, as if a child's small mouth might never notice the fissure if she leaned in close enough. Outside the kitchen doors, laughter pooled like a bright liquid against the glass. Crystal clinking, low music, people who had come expecting sparkle and plenty. Inside the staff hallway, the world finned to linoleum, fluorescent hum, the steady rhythm of a mop bucket being dragged, and the small sound of her own breath catching. The mansion's holiday party felt like a photograph she'd been cropped out of. Everybody smiling into the frame while she stood at the margin, holding a broken thing she wanted to make whole. "Just wrap it," Lucille said without pretense. Her voice had the flat certainty of an old rulebook. She stood close enough that Maya could smell the perfume that never left her collar, a bath of floral against the clinical bleach of the kitchen. "Don't make me have to say it twice. We don't waste anything here." Maya's hands trembled, not from cold, but from the effort it took to be invisible and kind at once. She folded a napkin around the cookie, smoothing the edges as if a neat presentation might repair the fissure at the center. If Eli needed to see a whole cookie, she would place it on the plate as if the break had been part of the design. Little expedients held her life together. A folded napkin, a whispered lie about it being warm from the oven, the balancing of money month to month so a child could have macaroni and not ask where the next thing would come from. "You know how many times you've had to be told, Maya?" Lucille's voice sharpened. She held a tray like accusation. "If you can't keep up, tell me. There's other people." "She's doing it," another cleaner said, eager to deflect. The kitchen doors shut. The hum of the party grew, the staff room contracted. The shove came not as a dramatic moment, but like a small and deliberate erosion. Lucille's hand made contact with Maya's shoulder, a push that carried with it years of ranked indignities. Maya stumbled, palms to tile. It was businesslike, a motion meant to remind. She tasted metal, the fear-thin tang of it, and the cookie slipped between her fingers, cracking further against the floor. For a beat, everything narrowed to tiny detail. The hairline fracture of sugar across the cookie, the bruise of blue under Maya's sleeve, the cold of tile against her knees. Lucille's eye held hers, and in it Maya read the ledger of appropriateness, what belonged to the servants and what belonged to the party. Around the corner, unseen, somebody laughed. The sound cut like a knife. Maya felt the kind of loneliness that has a shape and a sound. It coiled under the ribs. Her lips moved with a whisper so soft the refrigerator's hum drowned it out for everyone else, but not for the person who was 3 doors down in the kitchen pantry, whose hand had been paused over a tray, Tobias Hartman. "I just want to share a Christmas meal with my son," she breathed, less a prayer than a small, honest accounting of what would make everything right for one little while. Tobias's head lifted because his habit was to listen for the mechanics of the household. Sound told him where things were. The mansion produced a steady product of noises, the clip of heels, the unseen rubbing of piano keys in the next room, staff voices measured like instruments of an orchestra. He had come tonight to perform a ritual he'd long since learned, to circulate, to smile once in each room, to nod at people whose names were sometimes only face value. He wasn't meant to be a spy in the staff hallway. He wasn't, by design, supposed to notice the small domestic tragedies that happened in service rooms. He found his mouth forming a question he had no intention of asking. Whose life does this belong to? The whisper lodged itself in him with a strange tenderness. It was the kind of thing that remembered him back to the counter of his childhood kitchen, where his mother set bowls of soup down and hummed a tune under her breath while the rest of the neighborhood made a show of their lights. He had been a boy who kept his eyes low for fear of being sent up the street to be quiet. He had carried forward a certain etiquette of the rich: look, but do not feel too deeply. Tonight, something loosened. He watched Maya steady herself, the small gesture she made to catch the broken cookie, the way she folded the napkin with the care a parent keeps for a child's paper airplane. He saw the way her shoulders held both apology and a kind of truth. For the first time in years, a memory that wasn't an instrument of strategy breached the clean surface of his life. A woman with flour on her hands and a voice that smelled of cinnamon, who patched a plate in a winter that had no mercy. The memory felt like an ache he'd sworn to ignore. Tobias left the pantry with the deliberateness of a man moving down a chessboard. His steps were quiet but determined. He did not storm into the staff room. He did not deliver a rebuke to Lucille, though the impulse glittered at the edge of his thoughts. He reached instead for something smaller and more precise, a small bureaucratic kindness that could be enacted without spectacle. Paid leave, a check with no strings, a note to HR about short-term coverage. He found Patrick, his driver, in the corridor and spoke with the hushed clarity of someone who had discovered something private and couldn't unhear it. He placed a call to his executive assistant, a thin line of command into the machine of business. "Make sure she's protected," he said into his telephone, the voice of a man ordering a simple adjustment to an operating budget.
"I want her paid for the shift. And find me an HR contact, not just a temp, someone who can check in tonight." The person on the other side of the line, used to his sudden edits to the world, moved to comply. Small miracles are often administrative, Tobias thought. A late fee waived, an extension granted, someone to take a message. He did not want to be the one who fixed everything. He wanted, by the smallest of channels, to open a window that might admit light into a room that had been kept too long in shadow. Maya cleaned as if nothing happened, because that is what she had always done. The staff room demanded composure. It is a house of rules where anything resembling need was folded and labeled as inconvenient. She tucked a towel under her arm, eyes on the task like a person comforting the edge of a wound. Her phone lay face down on the mop sink like a sleeping child. When it vibrated, she let it. A text from Eli started and stopped, a line of sleepy letters that read like a prayer he did not know how to pray. "Did you make the mac and cheese? I miss you. Love you, Mama." She breathed. The world reassembled itself around the sound of Eli's name. She imagined his small fingers, the nest of his hair, the way his laugh folded her in. She smoothed the towel, and for a fraction of time it was possible to be brave by pretending nothing would ever break again. Someone slipped a small envelope under the staff room door. It landed beside her broom like a secret. She looked down and saw textured stationery, the kind restaurants keep for special notes. It bore her name in tidy black letters, and inside, a plain piece of paper with the simple words, "Please take the evening. Consider this paid leave. T.H." There was a check folded beneath it, the kind that felt like a permission slip more than wealth. Enough to cover a month of groceries and a night at a clinic, not a solution, but a relief. Her thumb hovered. The relief was so sharp it startled her. Relief has its own smell, like boiling water after drought. "Someone slipped that under the door," said Gabrielle, a fellow cleaner, softly. Her voice had a question mark at the end, the kind of wonder that happens when an old routine breaks. "Thanks him," Lucille said without ceremony, as if the act should be credited to obedience. Maya sat down on the lowest step of the back staircase and unfolded the paper as if it might be a map. The lighting above cast a thin, harsh band across the page. She read Tobias Hartman's initials and felt something like being seen. And with that sight came the release of a coiled thing she had carried for years. The story of a woman who had to be two people at once, the one who scrubbed floors and the one who dreamed small domestic miracles for a child. She pressed her forehead to the cool, painted stair. "Someone up there heard me," she whispered. It was a sentence of modest faith, not a theological claim, but an acknowledgement that the world was larger than the small square she occupied. If this early, tender moment of the story is touching you, leave a like and tell us your city in the comments where you celebrate the small salvations of life. The town car arrived without fanfare. Patrick, Tobias's driver, came down the servants' entrance with the same steady, unhurried courtesy he had practiced for years. He opened the back door and met Maya with a smile that was neither condescending nor forced. "Where to?" he asked. "Home." The word took shape slow in her mouth. It carried all the weight of a country you had not been sure you could return to. She thought of Eli's last photograph, him with a paper crown askew, and of the brittle calendar on her wall that marked bays with a red pen. She slid in beside Patrick, the upholstery smelling faintly of the leather polish the company used, and the car moved out into the cold polish of the night. The drive was its own kind of healing. The highway lights blurred into a procession of stars. For a while, the two people in the back seat were strangers bound by a small kindness. Patrick kept his gaze down, courteous, while Maya pressed her thumb into the fold of the note again and again as if it were a rosary. When she turned the key in the lock of her apartment, Eli's laughter spilled into the hallway like something too large to be contained. He was waiting at the door with pajamas that belonged on a smaller child, hair sticking up as if he had been wind-tossed and blessed. He threw himself into her arms with the fierce gravity only a 5-year-old could wield. The broken cookie slipped from her pocket like a guilty treasure and landed on the mat. Eli noticed but did not care. He smelled the town car and other people's perfumes and made a stew of all of it into a single word: Mommy. "How was work?" he asked, as only a child can do, turning a question into the softest of reckonings. "Busy," she answered, true and calm. She wiped his face with the cuff of her sleeve and made a quick calculation about bills and doctor visits, about whether the warmth of the evening could be enough to set things right. Lorraine, Maya's mother, watched from the kitchen table. Her face was the map of a life of small sacrificial work. White hair pulled into a bun, hands that had not stopped moving since her own childhood. She had laid out pancakes on the counter, an old tradition for nights the landlord's heater took a holiday. "You stayin'?" Lorraine asked, as much to test the air as to invite comfort. "I have a note," Maya said, and the words felt like an offering. She saw in her mother's eyes the inventory of relief and worry running like a ledger. "From Mr. Hartman. He paid me for the night." Lorraine's hands paused over a spatula. For a woman who had spent her life keeping count of dinner plates and grocery lists, the gesture amounted to a reprieve. "Good," she said simply. "You eat. Eli, say thank you." Eli chewed with the earnestness of a person who believed food had the power to patch the world. His laughter filled corners, chased away the enormity of the rest of the world. For a night, the house was a bright bowl of ordinary things: pancakes, syrup, the clatter of silverware. Maya watched him and allowed herself a small, private replenishment. When he fell asleep at last, chin resting on his folded blanket, she sat in the doorway and let the house hold her for a moment. The small kindness did not fix everything. The bruise under her arm ached. The broken cookie still lay in the pocket of her apron. But the night's purchase was not just about money. It felt like a signal that someone had seen her, and seeing is often the first step toward being counted. The next morning, the world had the soft, determined gray of a winter that refuses to give up its cold. Maya woke with a tenderness that felt almost foreign. She moved slowly, careful of the inner swell of pain that flared when she bent. At the clinic, the nurse took her request seriously. An X-ray later that day learned the secret of the bruise. A hairline fracture in the wrist, the kind that would not stop a woman from living but would demand she rest more than the life of work usually allowed. "You need to slow down for a spell," the doctor said kindly. "No heavy lifting for a few weeks." The prescription landed with the gentle authority of someone whose job is to declare limits on behalf of a fragile body. For a woman whose daily ledger was measured in loads and floors, an order to rest could look like a sentence. But there was the note and the check, which together felt like a bench on which to sit for a breath. Then came another message on her phone. It was short and businesslike, a thread of words that had somehow made the leap from the mansion's marble halls to her battered little phone. "Miss Williams, the Hartman Foundation would like to connect you with our Savannah Outreach Coordinator to discuss short-term flexible employment that allows for evening family time. Would you be available to meet? Denise H., Community Affairs." Maya read the message twice and then a third time. Denise's name had a professional ring that suggested a meeting, an agenda, a structure. The very grammar implied things would go through channels, job descriptions, interviews, paperwork. It was the kind of thing that could either be a line in a long catalog of corporate social responsibility or the beginning of an actual, steady doorway. She rested the phone across her knees and let the idea bloom like a slow-fire possibility. The word flexible pulsed with an intimacy that made her breath stop. A job that could be done with children tucked into bed? A kind of realignment of time around family. It glinted like a coin she hadn't been allowed to hold. Home became a place for small rituals. Eli's sticky fingers from breakfast jam that she had to scrub off. The appointment schedule pinned to the fridge like a small sacred map. The staff apron now folded with care and stored away. Lorraine kept watch, like someone who had learned to read the air and the people in it. "You should meet her," Lorraine said. "Denise." "The foundation's not going to change everything," Maya said aloud, partly to remind herself that nothing had fully shifted. She brushed her hand across the chipped kitchen counter. "They could just be polite. The world still asks for things from us." "Then you make the world ask for something different," Lorraine replied. "A kind of command that was less instruction than an old, necessary dignity. You stand right at that table and you tell them what you need, girl." Maya did not know if she had the language, though she had enough of the grammar of life to try. She had spent years in the language of servanthood. Apologies, efficiencies, the soft art of making discomfort invisible. But there were new verbs to learn: negotiate, strategize, build. Denise's invitation felt less like a gift than like a test she might pass if she became someone who learned to speak differently. Across town, Tobias Hartman sat in a study that smelled faintly of old books and citrus polish. A city beyond the window glittered with its own problems, none of which had the immediacy of a child's small voice. He sipped coffee and turned the photograph on the desk until it caught the light. It was a picture of his mother standing in front of a small storefront decades ago, an apron tied at the waist. She was younger in the photograph than Maya seemed to be now. There was flour on her cheek. The memory was not heroic. It was domestic and raw, and it refused to be corralled by his carefully managed schedules. The small actions he'd set in motion, the check, the note, the ride, had been pragmatic attempts to close an obvious gap. But the thread tugged at him. He found himself asking not what he could give, but what the institution he represented could change so that people like Maya would stop being surprises in the margins. He convened a quick meeting in his head with people he trusted: Denise, who ran community affairs with a steady hand; the HR director, who kept the company's sheet music in order; the leader of his foundation, who dealt in the scale of social projects and the metrics that justified capital. We do not need grand gestures, he thought. What we need is policy that honors people. He did not know how many times he had said words like that before, a man who had learned to define good with leverage and spreadsheets.
Now the words felt less like a line item and more like a responsibility. He set a new item on his to-do list. Attend the Savannah presentation. Listen. Do not lead the conversation. Find out what the people who had lived this life would say they needed. Maya went to the meeting because she had little else to lose and everything to bargain for. The conference room at the Hartman Foundation smelled of coffee and earnest intention. Denise was everything her business card implied: organized, practical, and steady-handed. She offered water, then an outline of programs, then the kind of soft metrics that made things feel both possible and accountable: job descriptions, wages mapped to living standards, childcare stipends. "You should know," Denise said at one point, looking at Maya more like a peer than a candidate, "our aim is to build roles where family is not a liability. We want jobs that let you tuck your kids in. We want supervisors who have been where you've been." Maya felt a small wariness at the sentence. "I don't want a pity job," she said. "I want to work. I want a steady shift that lets Eli sleep under the same roof every night." Denise nodded. "We're not interested in being a temporary feel-good story. This is a pilot with the aim of being sustainable. We want leadership that grew from lived experience. Will you consider an interview for a supervisory role in our Savannah outreach office?" Maya's mouth opened without a plan. Supervisory. The words sat heavy and warm. "You train workers, you help design schedules that don't kill people, you make sure the policies are real ones that people can live by," Denise answered. "We want someone who knows the work." The offer landed with something like the weight of a seed being placed in soil. Maya thought of Eli's laughter, of mornings with pancakes that someone else had flipped, of nights when the house felt too thin for comfort. She thought also of days being told to be small, to not ask for warmth. The role Denise described demanded courage, to stand in rooms where power had always been imagined as someone else's currency, and to insist on the dignity of ordinary labor. She thought of Lucille's shove and the bruise that shivered beneath her skin. She thought of standing on a low stair and feeling the world tilt for a breath. She thought about what it would mean to be the woman who made sure the next time someone's cookie broke, the response would be repair, not shame. "It's a lot to take in," Maya said finally, because the truth was that it was. "We can make it part-time at first," Denise offered, "flexible for you and your child. We'll do the paperwork like anyone else. It's under the company's structure, not a private favor. If it's right for you, then it grows." The careful language was vital. It was the kind of thing Maya needed. Not charity, not theater. Work that respected her as a whole person. She left the building that evening with a thin envelope in her hand, a formal invitation to a preliminary interview, a list of documents, and an outline of the job description. The air outside was clean with the first taste of winter. She walked slowly because her wrist still ached, and because the world felt altered in a way she wasn't sure how to name. On the walk home, her phone chimed. A short message from Tobias was terse and curious. "I'd like to hear about this." He'd written it to Denise, but somehow it landed back to her, an accidental courtesy that blunted the line between benefactor and fellow citizen. Maya stared at the screen and then at the photograph in her head of her son asleep, and felt the strange tilt of all things that change. How a tiny crack of kindness can widen into an opening, or how it can be a single thing easily closed again. She let herself imagine, briefly, the possibility of a life where she could be both a mother and a worker without the two being pitted against one another. The image was a small, dangerous luxury. Then the practical list of requirements pushed back. Interviews, references, displays of capability. The world still demanded evidence of worth. At night, when the house settled into its slow rhythms, Lorraine set out a small jar on the kitchen counter and labeled it with a strip of masking tape, Grace. It was a quaint thing, a small joke between women who have seen too much. Maya laughed because sometimes humor is the thread that keeps you from taking pain too seriously. The jar was empty now, waiting to be filled with small donations for a coat,
for bus fare, for the occasional necessity. It was domestic, unshowy, the kind of community practice that never makes the news but keeps life moving. The days that followed unfurled like thin pages. Maya kept working the shift she had been given, careful to not make a spectacle of her new possibility, while also learning the fragile art of setting boundaries with herself. She had learned, slowly, to say no to overtime when the doctor's orders were in black and white. It was both tiny rebellion and necessary survival. In the quiet hours, when Eli was at school and Lorraine at the church circle folding casseroles for the homeless, Maya practiced the language of leadership. She read articles Denise suggested, short, practical pieces about workplace dignity and supervisory best practices, and she wrote down questions she would ask in the interview. How do we handle accountability? What are the actual schedules? Who does the hiring? She wanted systems that could be trusted, because trust is fragile and must be reinforced by structure. Tobias, on his side, found himself returning to that staff hallway in memory so often that the recollection grew sharper than the photograph of his mother on the desk. He instructed his foundation team to draw up a standard operating policy for household staff that would be piloted across properties. Clear paid leave, a grievance procedure, and a small fund for emergencies. He did not make a show of it. He wrote memos, arranged meetings, and asked difficult questions about budget and scalability. He wanted systems that could be trusted, because trust is fragile and must be reinforced by structure. He invited Denise to lead the pilot, and she accepted with the kind of practicality that suggested a quiet hunger for results. One evening, as a test of the new policies, and partly from a compulsion he did not fully understand, Tobias requested an anonymous report from his house manager about staff conditions. The report came back with a list of complaints, and in it, the line about Maya's whisper was tucked like a note folded into a book. The item recommended a formal check-in with Maya. It read like a place on a map where someone had written, "Start here." He did not call himself a hero. He did not think of this as benevolence, but as the beginning of a responsibility that would need measure and the tedious work of policy. He knew better than to think a check or a ride could fix structural invisibility. But something, perhaps the memory of a woman with flour on her cheek, made him unwilling to let the moment pass unexamined. The next call he made was to Denise. "Don't give me a press release," he said. "Give me a plan, and make sure it's led by people who've lived it." Denise's laugh was short and sharp, the kind that meant she understood the difference between a photo op and an actual project. "We'll build it so it can be replicated," she said. "We'll keep accountability central." Replicated, accountable, led by lived experience, these were not slogans but the scaffolding of what could become a real project. Maya, for her part, had not yet said yes to anything. She felt gratitude for the way the letter and the check had softened the edge of the present. At the same time, she let the impulse ripen like a seed. If it grew, who would be in the garden? At night, she would sometimes hold Eli's little mitten and think of the ways in which small hands had to be warm. She thought of the cookie, a fracture of something ordinary turned into a hinge for a larger change. She did not want to be used as the story that absolved everybody else. She wanted durable dignity for the women like her, and if that required teaching, training, and sometimes tough boundaries with people who had hurt her, she would learn to do that work. On a gray morning, the call came. Denise wanted to schedule the interview. Could Maya come to the foundation office on Thursday? It felt like a pivot point, a hinge in a door. She nodded to the phone as if the small device carried the weight of decisions. She told Lorraine, who smiled with that sharp, weathered tenderness women of a certain age develop. "You do what feels right," Lorraine said, "but don't let them make you smaller." Thursday arrived with the kind of cold that made breath visible. Maya dressed in a sweater that had seen better days, but was clean and pressed, and she braided Eli's hair with the care of a ritual. She tucked in the form Denise had sent and rehearsed the words she might say. Leadership, she decided, meant translating lived experience into policy and then holding people to the structures that made dignity real. When she stepped into the foundation's reception area, it felt like stepping into a theater where each person had their own script, and the chance to speak might be granted if you did not fumble your lines. Denise greeted her and led her to a room where 3 people sat. A woman from HR who took notes with a professional detachment, Denise with her practical gravity, and a young man from the foundation whose job was to measure impact and not to offer platitudes. "We want to make sure any role is sustainable," Denise began. "Tell us about your experience. Tell us what needs to change." Maya spoke in the plain language that had become her trade. Schedules that respect bedtime, a chain of command that works for those who actually do the work, a grievance process that doesn't require someone to lose a day's wages to file a complaint. She did not give speeches. She described the day-to-day in the way of someone translating a lived ledger into policy talk. She spoke of the dignity of being seen. They asked questions that were sometimes practical and sometimes searching. What would she do if a head housekeeper discriminated? How would she balance the need to protect workers with the need to integrate with the family's expectations? She answered as someone who had lived through both sides of the ledger. She did not promise miracles. She spoke instead of policies and training and oversight. She was wary of forgiveness without accountability. She believed in second chances, but within a structure that demanded repair. When she left, Denise pressed a small card into her hand. "Lunch with Tobias Hartman next week," it read, and the ink had the weight of a follow-through. It was not the kind of proposal you often received. It was an invitation into the inner ring of decision-making. The thought of lunch froze and ungrounded her all at once. It felt like being called into a room you'd only ever watched through a window. But it also felt like an opportunity to shape the conversation. On the way home, Maya stopped at the corner shop and bought a loaf of bread, because there was no poetry about power that didn't begin with bread shared at a table. The cashier wrapped the loaf with practiced hands and offered a sympathetic smile when she learned of Maya's meeting. In public exchanges like that one, people sometimes offered small kindnesses that held more dignity than any grand gesture. That night, Tobias sat in his study looking at a photograph of his mother again. He turned it in his hands and thought about how a single whispered wish in a staff hallway had become a chain of small administrative acts. He did not know where it would all lead. He had asked for structure and accountability because that was the only way he knew to turn a single act of noticing into a system that could be replicated. He had also learned something else: that he could not lead this project without stepping back from the posture of a benefactor and into the posture of a partner. He wondered what it would mean to give up the comfort of being right in order to let those who had lived the work lead it. The question prickled. He had power and he had money, but he had also learned, slowly, sometimes too late, that money without structure is vanity, and power without listening is violence. In a small house across town, Maya tucked Eli into bed and smoothed the blanket over him. He reached up and touched her face in the way of a child trying to measure the adult he loved, up to his cheek, then turning to his hair. "You comin' for pancakes tomorrow?" he murmured, half asleep. "I'll be there," she said. The promise sat like a small anchor. She kissed his forehead and left the room quietly, stepping into the dimness of the kitchen where the jar labeled Grace smiled back at her like a small private joke. Her phone chimed. It was a calendar invite. Lunch with Tobias Hartman, Wednesday. The time and place were precise and neutral. She stared at the screen and thought of the broken cookie, of the shove in the kitchen, the check under the door, the town car, Denise's practical eyes. Each event was a small hinge on the door that might open a life into something steadier. She felt cautious and hopeful in equal measure. The path ahead had no guarantee. There would be interviews, policies to draft, boundaries to hold, and people who would test her capacity for both mercy and accountability. The pause was a kind of high wire, exciting because the future trembled with possibility, terrifying because there was so much she could lose if she misstepped. Maya turned the calendar invite over in her mind and then looked toward the jar labeled Grace. If the rest of the world was going to be built differently, she thought, maybe it would begin with small things. A cracked cookie repaired, a night off that let a child sleep under the same roof every evening, a job title that carried both wages and the authority to keep schedules humane. A lot of change could come from small insistences stitched together into policy. She set her phone down and let the quiet sink in. Tomorrow would bring a lunch at a table that once felt impossibly distant. Tonight, she let herself hold the exhausted joy of a child asleep and a jar waiting to be filled. The world had shifted marginally, not in the way a fireworks display transforms the night, but like the subtle increment of a tide that, in time, can remake a coast. And somewhere in his study, Tobias closed his eyes and rehearsed what it would sound like to listen without an agenda, to make policy that honored faces he had forgotten how to imagine as neighbors. He did not plan to be anyone's rescuing light. He planned instead to try to create mechanisms that would make a whisper be heard before it had to break a woman into confession. The lunch would ask a question, not of what either of them could do alone, but of how they might build a world where a maid's Christmas wish was never a whisper in a pantry, where small kindnesses were not the end but the first step towards systems that kept dignity intact. The answer would not arrive in a single meal. It would require patience, structure, and the willingness of those in power to be partners rather than patrons. Maya leaned against the sink and closed her eyes for a moment. The house hummed around her, the old heater cycling on, Eli's even breathing, Lorraine's radio humming quietly in another room. She folded her hands, not in prayer or in policy, but in a small readiness for the work ahead. She had been a maid for as long as she could remember, and that identity had been both a source of pride and a fence she had to climb from time to time. The invitation to lunch felt like a gate opening. On the other side would be bureaucracy and scrutiny, and the chance to argue for dignity in language that mattered to people who wrote checks and set schedules. She took a breath and mapped out how she would talk. She would speak plainly. She would insist on accountability. She would carry the bruises as proof of what needed to change and not as marks that defined her worth. Above all, she would remember the small things, the smell of cinnamon on a cracked cookie, the sound of her son's laughter, because the world they were trying to build needed to be rooted in those ordinary truths. Outside, the city lights blurred like a constellation of small opportunities, each one waiting for a hand to reach and make it part of a broader design. The first chapters of that design were being written now, in a staff room, over a check folded into an envelope, in Denise's office, and at a table where a billionaire and a maid would soon sit across from each other and negotiate not just charity but the grammar of work. Maya folded the napkin back into a small, neat square and placed it in the jar labeled Grace, not because the jar would pay a mortgage, but because rituals keep us honest. She turned off the light and climbed the stairs to her small room, where a child slept and tomorrow promised a conversation that could change how many other children were put to bed with certainty. She did not know whether the lunch would be the hinge or merely a hinge shadow. She did know she would go. And the decision to go, to sit at a table where the terms of work would be discussed, felt like the first line of a story being told aloud, one that would require many voices to finish. The day of the lunch arrived with sky the color of pewter, the kind of light that flattens everything and makes faces more honest. Maya stood at the small mirror above the sink. There was no time for theater, and smoothed the collar of the sweater she'd chosen because it was clean and not conspicuous. Eli had made her a paper crown at preschool and, when she asked, had insisted she wear it to the meeting. She folded it into the pocket of her bag like a talisman. The Hartman Foundation's conference room felt different at noon than it had in the dim of late afternoon interviews. People who worked there were not always the ones who gave instructions. They tended to move like people tethered to a purpose, which felt at once hopeful and dangerous. Tobias was already seated at the end of the table, but he did not sit like a man waiting to be waited on. He sat like someone who had waited too long to learn how to ask the right questions. He rose when she entered, offering his hand, which she took with an economy of gestures that matched her. He did not speak the language of patronage. Instead, his voice carried the tone Denise had asked of him, plain, restrained, asking to be corrected. "Ms. Williams," he said, "please call me Tobias if you're comfortable." She kept her response brief, "Maya." They sat across from one another with Denise and two others from the foundation at the flanks, like quiet witnesses. Tobias glanced at the file in front of him, but did not open it. He wanted the conversation unframed by corporate memos. "I want to hear from you," he said simply, "about what works and what doesn't. Not what I can do for you, but what the foundation can build so people don't have to ask for relief." The question landed where it was meant to, a small, serious provocation. Maya swallowed. Words had a way of sounding too big in rooms like this, where meaning could be converted into policy and then into metrics. She reminded herself to speak like the work she knew, plain, precise, honest. "I'll tell you what I know," she began. "Start with schedules. Families need the promise of bedtime. It's simple. If someone's job says start at 4 in the morning and they don't get home until midnight, that's a job that takes your life away. We need real shifts, not phantom ones. Second, a grievance system that doesn't punish the person who reports. You should be able to say when something's wrong without losing a day's pay. Third, people with lived experience at every table where decisions are made. Supervisors who've done the work see things others can't." She spoke about mundane cruelties as if they were things that could be listed on an expense report, because that's what they were. Costs society extracted from people who weren't asked to sit in rooms like this. She told a story about the night she'd fixed the broken cookie because the party needed the illusion of perfection, and how small indignities gathered until they shaped what a life would become. She did not dramatize. She made case after case grounded in the ledger of everyday life. When she finished, Tobias sat with his hands folded. He had the look of a man who was processing, not through spreadsheets, but through an instinct he was learning to respect. "How would you like to lead the pilot in Savannah?" he asked. Maya's first reflex was suspicion. The word pilot had a way of meaning one-off. She asked, "Under whose authority?" "Under the foundation's. HR will set a formal job, payroll, benefits. Supervisors will be hired and trained. We want someone who can stand up policies and test them, and, this is important, we want transition paths. If something works in Savannah, it should be scalable to other locations. But it needs a leader who knows the work. Will you consider it?" She let the silence do some of her work. "I will consider it," she said, careful. "But if this is to be real, there must be clarity. Written schedules, grievance protections, a fund for emergencies that anyone can access without a bureaucratic maze, and measurable steps for accountability. No private favors, no backdoor lines. Also, if a supervisor is abusive, there must be a path that protects workers while offering real rehabilitation if the abuser wants it. I won't be a prop." Tobias nodded. "Agreed. And I want you to help design the oversight. Decisions should be made by a committee that includes people who've lived it." Denise leaned forward with an energy that said she had been waiting for precisely this. "We'll make it part of the job description. We'll include training budgets, childcare stipends, and a pilot fund. We'll set a timeline for evaluation at 3, 6, and 12 months. And," she looked at Maya, "we'll guarantee that anyone in the pilot has the same HR protections as other employees. This is employment, not charity." Maya's relief was guarded. She asked about pay, about how schedules would be enforced, about who would be in charge of hiring. Denise offered numbers and timelines and the kind of procedural language that made the project feel possible. Tobias, at one point, reached into his pocket and pulled out a small band of metal, an engraved token with the word multiply on it. He did not offer it like a present. He set it on the table like an emblem of a promise he wasn't sure he had the right to make. "If this works," he said, "we'll find ways to expand. But I want the story to be written by the people doing the work." Maya touched the band, felt the cool metal. It was a small thing, but it had the awkward generosity of symbols. She accepted without theatrics. "I'll need to talk to Lorraine and Eli," she said finally. "If I'm being asked to step into a role like that, I need it to be something my family can live on." Tobias looked at her with an openness that had nothing to do with his bank accounts and everything to do with a new, tentative humility. "If you accept, I want this to respect your life," he said. "If it ever feels like it's pulling you away from your child, we correct it. No job should require you to miss being a mother."
They drafted a preliminary offer on a napkin there, a startlingly old-fashioned thing in a modern office. Hours that respected evenings, salary with benefits, and a start date that allowed for rest after her fracture healed. Denise promised training budgets and a hiring process led by a committee that included Maya, Denise herself, and 2 other community leaders. They would hire Jamira, a name Denise mentioned as an emerging community organizer, to be a lead mentee, and Maya would be part of the selection. When Maya left the table, she had a file with ink and a small helping of possibility. She walked out into the light and felt the same small, dizzy gratitude that a lot of women learn to hide, the feeling of being allowed to imagine a different future. She did not mistake the meeting for a miracle. The offer was layered with conditions and strings of approvals, but it was tangible. It had shape. Back at home, Eli responded to the news with the seriousness only a child can muster. "Do you get a name tag?" he asked, proud as if this were a badge of honor. "You already gave me a name tag," Maya said, ruffling his hair. "You gave me the name Mama." They celebrated with pancakes, because some promises can be honored right away without waiting on paperwork. Lorraine, who wanted to see the offer become something steady, grinned like a war veteran who had just learned victory could be measured in small, consistent steps. Training began with the dull, steady work of reading manuals, sitting in classes, and having hard conversations. Maya learned HR language so she could translate it into things her peers could use: how to file a complaint, how to request accommodation, who held the keys to payroll. She started meeting with staff, listening to stories that repeated the same refrains, schedules that eroded family life, managers who dismissed reports, the small economies of shame that had trained people to keep their hurt inside. Jamira arrived for her first day with a bright, nervous energy. She had been a single parent herself, had once run a neighborhood after-school program, and had a way of naming problems that was both raw and inventive. Maya watched her work like a mentor watches a seed put in credible soil. "You'll do fine," Maya told her. "Listen more than you talk at first. Keep humility like a tool." The first concrete change was modest: a posted schedule with real consequences for last-minute shift changes and a subsidy for before-school care. It cost money the foundation had budgeted and required a small software change to track compliance. But the small changes began to have outsized effects. Workers could plan. Parents could enroll children in programs without the risk of being called in for a double shift. That simple predictability made evenings sane and mornings bearable. Maya's authority was rarely dramatic. It manifested in the way she navigated conversations and insisted on documentation. When a head housekeeper misapplied a disciplinary rule, Maya insisted on a review. The head housekeeper, Lucille's old position, bristled. "You don't tell me how to run my staff," an older woman said at one meeting, snapped like a twig breaking. Maya answered with something steady. "I'm asking that everyone follows the same rulebook. If there's a problem, we document it and we teach it. We don't shame a person into silence." Her voice had the kind of firmness that accrues from living inside struggle and choosing to speak clearly. Soon, the Savannah pilot had a calendar, training modules, grievance procedures, and a small emergency fund that required only a short application and a decision within 72 hours. Denise kept the project on the rails, Tobias kept the budgets honest, and Maya kept the lived experience at the center. They measured not just outputs, but whether people's lives got easier. Did a parent tuck children in more nights? Could someone afford a cold night's heating? The metrics were human and stubbornly practical. Word spread the way these things do, through text messages and group chats, through church boards, through the slow chain of neighborhood worker networks.
People like Jamira began to show up to mentoring sessions with lists of ideas, training in basic finance, workshops on navigating childcare subsidies, a simple protocol on how to resist abusive supervisors. The RISE project, as it came to be known informally among the staff, grew out of a patchwork of need and a single decision to let those who'd lived the work design the answers. Maya found that the hardest part of leadership was not policy, but trust. Trust was not given, it had to be earned from both sides. When a worker accused a supervisor of belittlement, Maya had to hold the rage of those who had been hurt and the structure that required process. She convened meetings where both parties could bring witnesses, where the foundation's HR representative explained the steps, and where restitution was defined. Lucille's name, like a shadow, hovered in the background of many of these conversations. People remembered the shove, the habit of humiliation. Some wanted immediate barring. Others thought rehabilitation might be possible. Then, one cold afternoon, Lucille walked into the foundation office asking for help. Her posture had the frailty of someone who had been forced by time to face consequences. She had aged into a kind of urgency, a request that sounded like a plea. Maya received the message the same way she'd received other tricky things. She took it seriously and scheduled an interview. There in the meeting room, Lucille sat with a clasped paper bag of her own, her eyes frequently searching the surface of the table as if it might contain forgiveness or at least instruction. "I'm not sure what to do," Lucille said, voice low. "I did things then I'm not proud of.
I've been asked to apply for retraining by the company that hired me, but I'm old and I don't know if I can learn new ways." Maya felt the sting of memory, but also the weight of institutional responsibility. This was the moment policies were tested, the moment to ensure accountability without cruelty. "If you want to work in this system, there's a process," she said. "It begins with owning what you did. Then there's training. Then there's supervised work, and there's oversight. No one's saying you're erased because of your past, but you must accept terms." Lucille nodded. "I'll do it," she said, "if you set the terms." So they did. The terms included a written admission, a required training program, a period of supervised shifts where a mentor would assess behavior, and a restitution plan for those who were harmed. Lucille agreed and enrolled in classes that taught conflict resolution and modern supervisory skills. The foundation offered counseling resources. Maya insisted that the rehabilitation not be a facade, but a monitored program with clear outcomes. The staff response was mixed. Some coworkers demanded immediate barring. Others considered the possibility that a person could change if held to tangible accountability. "Trust but verify," Maya told them, which was also how she tried to run any policy, tender but rigorous. Over months, Lucille attended sessions, wrote letters of apology to the staff, and did supervised shifts where she learned different ways to manage stress without degrading those under her. It was slow and often painful for everyone. Trust rebuilt itself in increments, sometimes eroding and sometimes repairing. Meanwhile, the pilot's public face grew. Maya helped organize the first community open house, an event that had been at first a checkbox in a grant application but became something much larger, a gathering of workers, families, city officials, and donors who came to listen. The RISE project set up booths for childcare sign-ups, financial coaching, and a kids' baking table where volunteers led a gingerbread session that was at once symbolic and practical. Children learned to frost, and adults learned that a kitchen could be a place of business training and community, not only service. Maya's speech at the open house was short. She had no taste for public theater. Her words aimed to make things clear. She told the story of a broken cookie. She did not dramatize the shove. She described instead what it taught her, that being seen matters. She introduced Jamira and other mentees who shared how the pilot had made small, concrete changes in their lives, shifts that respected bedtime, an emergency fund used to keep a child warm one particularly bad storm, a grievance filed and resolved without retribution. The applause at the end of her speech felt less like a claim for her and more like a collective sigh.
relief that someone had finally translated hurt into the language of policy. Tobias stood at the fringe, his hands folded, not looking for credit. He listened when people spoke about the pain his wealth could never fix, and he listened when they told him how his institution could step into a proper role: funder, partner, guarantor of standards, not deus ex machina. The project drew notice beyond Savannah. A small delegation from a neighboring city came to learn. A local reporter wrote an article that avoided the usual tropes, favoring details about the policy changes and the workers' voices. The pilot's metrics looked promising: reduced turnover, increased childcare stability, but the real measure was softer and slower: an adult who could tuck children in at night, the way a parent's hands remembered. And then came the offer that tested the arc of Maya's choices: an invitation to a national summit in Chicago, an opportunity to present the pilot and to step into a larger role. The offer meant travel, visibility, and the possibility of replicating the model across multiple sites. It also meant long hours and the risk that Eli might miss the presence of his mother. Lorraine, already adept at reading the shape of decisions, sat Maya down at the kitchen table and made the kind of calculus that only those who've juggled families and paychecks can make. "You want to change things for a lot of people," Lorraine said, hands buttoning a blouse with the ease of someone who had stitched 1,000 hems. "But you also promised pancakes." Maya laughed, because that was the truth in plain clothes. "We can scale, but not at the cost of what keeps me a mother," she said. "If the role asks me to be gone all the time, it's not the right move." She negotiated. The foundation offered a remote leadership track and planned the Chicago engagement so that she would co-present with Jamira and one of Denise's colleagues, sharing the narrative spotlight. They proposed a regional director role that would create a pathway for others to step into leadership locally, and they agreed to fund childcare for conference travel and to stagger her travel so Eli would be grounded at home. Maya accepted the compromise with the cautious optimism of someone who has learned to bargain for the life she wanted rather than to settle for what was handed to her. The decision allowed her to hold two truths: that her voice could be amplified and that her son should not be the price of that amplification. Work expanded. The RISE project found a small plot of land, an old warehouse with tall windows, and they began plans for a physical center, a place with a childcare wing, meeting rooms, a small commercial kitchen for job training, and a room set aside for people like Lucille to undergo supervised mentorship. Tobias resisted naming the center after himself. "It should belong to the people it serves," he said. "We can fund it, but it should belong to them." They named the building the RISE Center, a sober, functional name that fit the project's modest ambition: to lift and to teach how to keep being lifted. Community members contributed their time, city officials signed a small grant, and volunteers painted murals. Maya led sessions on supervisory practices and co-wrote a handbook that named standards plainly: how many hours a supervisor could request in a week, the penalties for unauthorized schedule changes, and the process for restitution. Jamira ran the youth baking program that had once been only a symbol. She taught kids to measure and fold dough, to time ovens, to keep a ledger. One day, Jamira looked up from a tray of golden cookies and said, "These kids need to know how to make money that loves them back." Maya watched her and felt like a midwife to many small births. The band Tobias had placed on the table months ago had multiplied into a small ring of tokens for staff, tiny reminders that they were not alone in the work. Tobias had asked that the tokens be symbols of a commitment to replication, and so they were shared, some given to mentors, others to people who had led an internal policy reform. They were not gifts meant to tie anyone to him. They were, in Maya's view, shared signifiers of a communal project. The renovations moved faster than anyone expected. On the morning of the RISE Center's ribbon cutting, the air smelled of paint and coffee and the faint, buttery scent of baking from Jamira's youth kitchen. The sign hung above the door: simple typeface, steady letters, RISE Center. City officials gave brief remarks, then Denise spoke about accountability. Tobias said a few words and then stepped to the side. He had learned the posture of not being front and center in these moments. He let Maya speak. She did not recount her past as a spectacle. She told a small story about a cookie and a wish whispered in a pantry, and she used it to point to the work. "We are not here because one person decided to be kind," she said. "We are here because we decided to build systems that listen before they shatter people." The crowd listened like people who had been waiting for the permission to hope without naivete. The Rise Center did its work quietly at first. Childcare, vocational training, a housing advisory desk. People who had once been invisible found themselves in leadership tracks. Jamira moved from mentee to program lead, holding a class on night shift rights. Lucille moved through her supervised period not as if she had been instantly forgiven, but as someone whom a system asked to prove transformation in ways that could be seen and measured. She worked under mentorship for 6 months. She made restitution where it had been requested, and slowly some coworkers accepted supervised shifts with her. Others remained wary. The program's insistence on both accountability and possibility became its backbone. 3 years later, the RISE project had seed programs in 2 other cities. The model proved that policy designed by lived experience could reduce turnover, increase job satisfaction, and, most crucially to Maya, let children sleep under the same roof most nights. Her role changed from supervisor to founder, a transition that required her to learn to step off the day-to-day and into strategy. She sometimes missed the immediacy of direct work, but the trade-off was clear. She could influence dozens of programs and hundreds of lives. The real measure arrived quietly one Christmas morning. Maya had invited a small group of friends and colleagues to her place for a meal. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and orange peel. Eli had made a decoration, a hand-drawn sign that read Mama's Table in crayon, and it hung over the doorway with all the grandeur a 5-year-old could muster. Guests included Lorraine, Jamira with her son, Denise, and, on the margin, Tobias, who had attended only after being explicitly invited as a partner and not a host. He arrived with a loaf of bread and a look that had taken on a different kind of humility over the years. He sat at the edge of the table in the way someone sits when they are being careful to let others lead. Lucille came too, her presence negotiated by the restitution plan. She had been allowed to attend because she had met the terms set by the community, and because those harmed had consented to her presence. The air between those at the table had the thinness of something still fragile, but people had learned to eat with that in mind. Maya prepared a plate and set a cookie before Eli, not the cracked one from years prior, but a small, fresh round that she and Jamira had baked at the Rise Center. It was whole and warm, and the symbol felt less like a talisman and more like a testimony to the many small hands that had repaired what had been broken. Eli raised his fork like it was a scepter and declared a blessing in the only way children do, loud, earnest, and untrained. "We have pancakes and cookies and mama and cookies," he said. The room laughed, the sound filling corners. Across from him, Tobias watched with interest that had become steady. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small band, another token, but this time he placed it not on the table in a gesture of presentation, but into Maya's palm, and then turned it to Jamira. "For the people who keep starting things," he said quietly, the sincerity plain. Maya slid the band to Jamira, who took it with eyes that shone. There was no spectacle. There was a transfer of a small object that symbolized shared work. The evening did not imitate a fairy tale. There were still bills and programs to manage, and rumors of funding cycles that required attention. There were community members who felt left behind and who demanded more. But the room had an anchoring reality. People who had once been told to be invisible were now at the table where decisions were made. Later, in the quiet after dishes were washed and children asleep, Maya stood on her stoop and looked up at the sky. The jar, labeled Grace, still sat on her counter, now more often used as a collection jar for the Rise Center's small fundraising drives. It contained little coins and a few notes, literal, practical help that would pay for bus tickets, for a blanket on a cold night. It was domestic and ordinary and effective. She felt the ache of responsibility, the way it lived across bones when one had children and a cause. But she also felt a steadier warmth, the warmth of a life aligning, slowly, with an intention that matched her values. Her son's laughter, the Rise Center's sign swinging slightly in a breeze that smelled of paint and possibility. The woman who had once shoved her, now in retraining and under oversight. Each of these were part of a complicated mosaic. None erased pain, but each suggested a way to live with it differently. Tobias walked with her to the sidewalk and paused. He did not reach for grand statements. Instead, he asked, "How can I be better at stepping back?" Maya gave him a look that held both empathy and a kind of teacher's patience. "You already learned the hardest part," she said. "You listened. Now keep listening. Don't put your signature on everything. Let people lead. Fund what they ask for, not what makes you feel good. Keep the systems in place so the kindness doesn't have to rely on your presence." He nodded. "I will try." The winter that followed did not produce miracles. There were program audits, a budget that required tough decisions, and a few staff departures. But when Maya tucked Eli into bed and he reached for his hand, she had the quiet satisfaction of a life that now included the restful, ordinary things. Pancakes on a Saturday, admission policies that favored caretakers, a kid's laugh that meant the world had for now a dependable center. On Christmas Eve, the Rise Center hosted a simple meal. People came with casseroles and folding chairs. There was a table where small gifts for children were donated anonymously, and a table where staff and community leaders ate together. Maya stood for a moment watching the room from the doorway. The same kind of watching she had done in the mansion kitchen years ago, but now from the place of someone who had helped open a door. She found Jamira arranging napkins into neat stacks, and Lucille at a corner decorating cookies with the seriousness of someone trying to earn a second chance honestly. Tobias stood at the back, carrying a box of donated toys, his posture the careful one of an ally. Maya's mind went back to the pantry whisper, to the brittle tile beneath her knees, to the first check slipped under a door. She realized the wish had been literal and spiritual at once. A meal with her son, and the hope that a world could be built in which that meal was not a miracle, but a rite.
The night closed with a quiet, candles blown out one by one, the hum of the heater, children already wrapped in sleep. Lorraine pressed a hand into Maya's shoulder and said what mothers often say without ceremony, "You did good." Maya smiled, not in triumph, but in gratitude. "We did," she corrected. The pronoun was deliberate. It included everyone in that small room and all those who had labored to make policy about dignity. She walked home with Eli's hand in hers, the child's warm palm a small, steady proof that some things could be kept. On the table in her small kitchen lay the jar marked Grace, along with a new envelope from the foundation, a brief note about next year's expansion, and a modest grant for a scholarship program for Rise Center apprentices. She pinned the envelope beside the jar, and then, for a small private ritual, took the paper crown Eli had made and set it on top of the jar, as if to say that home could hold both jest and ceremony. She tucked the engraved band into the little box she kept for tokens, objects that carried promise but not power. Before bed she kissed Eli's forehead. He breathed the way children do, complete trust tethering him fast. "Mama?" he murmured. "Yes." "Did your wish come true?" Maya thought of the cracked cookie and the small whisper that had been heard. She thought of the months of work and the difficult conversations, and the policies that had been written, and the people who had been asked to risk being honest. She thought of the Rise Center sign, the way Jamira laughed, the small band of metal that had become less a gift from a man and more a shared symbol. It did, she said, because it had, though not in the miraculous, singular way she might once have imagined. It came true across lots of small decisions, through policy and mercy, through the stubborn practice of listening,
and the slow work of building systems. Her whisper had not summoned a savior. It had found a door that people chose to open and then to reframe. Outside the window, the city's lights blurred, not like fireworks, but like a slow constellation. Maya thought of all the quiet rooms still to be made visible. Other kitchens, other pantries, other whispers. She was tired and hopeful, and the two could coexist. In the morning she would run another training, answer emails from other cities interested in the model, and make sure the Rise Center's emergency fund had been replenished. She would hold meetings about staffing and childcare and balance sheets. But tonight she lingered in the small relief of a wish that had moved from being a secret to becoming a program that could be replicated. As she turned off the light, she remembered the low, private voice in the pantry, the sound that had shifted a man's attention enough to make a small set of administrative choices that then rippled outward. The story had not been about a single check or a single town car. It had been about recognition and the slow, laborious commitment to make that recognition into law, into policy, into everyday habit. On the mantel next to the jar, she placed the cracked gingerbread cookie, the one she had kept, now tucked inside a small frame, not as a relic of pain, but as an emblem of the hinge that began a longer arc. It would remind her on hard days, small wishes can be the start of something larger if enough people agree to lean into the work of repair. The Rise Center's doors stayed open long after Christmas. The programs continued, as did the hard edges of real life. People got sick, budgets had to be trimmed, old habits crept in and had to be corrected. But a pattern was set, systems that listened, leaders who had lived the work, and a community that gradually learned how to hold both mercy and accountability without sacrificing either. If Maya's story moved you, and you'd like to learn more or support the work the Rise Project is doing, subscribe and visit the link in the description to find ways to get involved or to donate.